We interrupt this program for breaking news from the Global National Newsroom.
Hello, I'm Robin Gill. For the third day in a row, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will be addressing the nation, providing updates on the federal plan during this COVID-19 crisis. The Prime Minister is in self-isolation at his home after his wife was diagnosed with the new coronavirus. He's expected to announce the closure of the Canada-U.S. border to everything but essential trade and commerce in an effort to slow the spread of this pandemic. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has already confirmed the agreement, an unprecedented agreement, between the American administration and the Canadian government. Already this morning, he has tweeted, "We will be, by mutual consent, temporarily closing our northern border with Canada to non-essential traffic. Trade will not be affected. Details to follow." Now, we're still waiting for the Prime Minister to provide those details. On Tuesday, there was a significant spike in cases across Canada. Officials say that it is partly because of the push for more COVID-19 testing. The total number of deaths in Canada is 8. In terms of total infections, the situation is changing quickly. Over the last week, the number of cases has grown steadily in this country, and it continues to climb. The Finance Minister is set to speak shortly. We'll bring you those details when it happens. But let's bring in our senior national correspondent, Mike Armstrong. He's in Ottawa. Mike, earlier this week, the Prime Minister talked about, banning non-Canadian residents, non-Canadian citizens, but the exception was the U.S. It has now changed. Can you give us some details?
Sure. Well, we're hearing that, obviously the President has now confirmed it, and the Prime Minister will make it official, I guess, from a Canadian perspective, that non-essential travel will be stopped at the border. So basically, they want to keep the supply routes going. The Deputy Prime Minister yesterday talked about how important it is that food continues to cross the border, medicine continues to cross the border, as well as important labor continues to cross the border. They had to keep that going. There's been sort of a negotiation in recent days to make sure that the relationship with the U.S. stays strong. When this announcement is made, it will be very clear that it was mutually agreed upon. They want to make sure that the person in the White House is not upset in any way. As a matter of fact, if you watch what's going on between China and the U.S., that relationship is quite strained right now, with the president repeatedly calling or referring to the Wuhan or the China virus, and China yesterday kicking out, I believe it's 6 journalists from that country. So protecting that relationship has been an important part of doing what is a very difficult, painful thing to do, closing that border today.
Mike, the key thing is that tourists will not be allowed to go across, but there are going to be some exemptions, and that includes truck drivers, and they're going to be obviously finding ways to monitor that. And also healthcare workers who work on both sides of the border.
Can you frame me up first?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, confirmed.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question, Robin.
Mike, we're just talking about this limit to travel between the two countries. We know that tourists are going to be banned. That was the key element that came out, but the other exemptions are going to be truck drivers. There has to be a way to monitor these truck drivers because they're obviously bringing goods back and forth. The other thing is going to be monitoring healthcare workers who work on both sides of the border. They'll be considered essential workers.
Yeah, there are going to be some exemptions we're hearing, as well as people traveling through Canada to go to another country. It's really delicate closing the border. You've got Point Roberts in BC, you've got Campobello Island in New Brunswick, where the only route from one country into their own country is through the other country. It's tough. If you're in Campobello Island, New Brunswick, you have to travel into Maine to get back into Canada. So it is a really, really complicated thing to do. That's obviously one of the things they've been looking at. As travelers with family care, we're hearing, will also be allowed to continue crossing the border. It really has been important to keep the border fluid, keep things moving. But tourists will be stopped. And it's quite interesting because we've had this situation where the border's been open to tourists, but politicians have been saying, tourists, stay home. Now it'll be made official.
The other big announcement today will be the economic stimulus package. Our Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, will be outlining that after the Prime Minister speaks. What are we learning? I think we were talking about somewhere between $20 and $30 billion.
We're hearing now $27 billion, sort of in 2 phases. The first phase will be to get money to Canadians who need it, people who maybe have lost their jobs in this crisis because their offices or businesses have closed temporarily, possibly even permanently. Also to help people who are self-employed, as well as part-time workers who aren't working right now and therefore down the road won't qualify for EI. So they're trying to get that money to them. Another part of this emergency aid will be set aside for later on in this crisis to try and stimulate the economy when we start coming out of it. So they're also thinking down the road.
All right, Mike, thanks for that. We'll get back to you later, but let's go to Sean O'Shea. He joins us from the Canadian side of the border at Whirlpool Bridge in Niagara Falls. Sean, what are people saying there?
Well, Robin, good morning. It's pretty quiet here. People are kind of used to the idea already, I think, because the amount of border traffic here has been reduced. I'm standing, as you said, in front of the Whirlpool Bridge. This is one of 4 bridges to the United States in the Niagara region. One in Queenston, 2 in Niagara Falls, 1 in Fort Erie. So this is a huge border community. Border business is big in the city of Niagara Falls. The bridge I'm at is not a commercial bridge. In other words, to go across this bridge, you have to be a Nexus card holder. So people on this bridge, also known as the local bridge, frequently coming from Niagara Falls, Ontario, people go across to shop and grocery shop in the United States, and people frequently shop the other way. So this is a point of non-commercial traffic, much as the Rainbow Bridge just down the street where people would come over and go to the casino. So this is already quite less traveled now, but it will be, of course, even less travel when this ban takes effect.
Sean, there's a sense of community there with both sides of the border. It's not just that it's America and Canada. It really is a bigger community there.
You know that because you lived here, Robin. It's very much a sense of one community. Niagara, people have to go, we're in the Falls, Ontario, versus the Falls in New York State. The flow of traffic here, for people who don't realize it, is ever present. People go for lower priced gas in the United States. They go for shows over here. The Shaw Festival, when it's on, is dominated by so many Americans that come across here. We still see people coming across right now. So it is really almost, in many respects, one community. And so closing the border here is something that it's just never been done, and something that will be an especially big deal for this community, which in many ways sees itself as one large community, even though people are on both sides of the border. We also have some Canadians who live on the U.S. side and work on the Canadian side. That's something that has been going on for years here. Very much one community, Robin.
And that's the key here, is the Canadians that are living on that side of the border, how they'll be able to cross back and forth. And of course, we're waiting for that announcement from the Prime Minister, Sean O'Shea, in the Niagara region. Let's go back to Mike Armstrong and talk about the other ways that this economy is trying to be stimulated. One thing is that the banks are delaying mortgage payments, but of course on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, we heard that announcement last night, a joint announcement from Canada's 6 major banks. So you're talking about the Bank of Montreal, CIBC, National Bank of Canada, RBC, Scotiabank, and TD. So they came together last night to say that they're going to try and help, an effort to help with, quote, personal and small business banking customers on a case-by-case basis to provide flexible solutions to help them manage the challenges coming forward, such as pay disruption due to COVID-19, child care disruption due to school closures, or those facing illness. So that is a pretty big and important measure to help Canadians from coast to coast. We're also hearing that it hasn't been made official yet, but that the tax deadline will be pushed back from April 30th to June 1st. That's, by the way, a measure Quebec already did over the weekend. So that's expected to come probably very likely today.
We've also got some big companies that are closing temporarily. Honda is closing its North American plants for 6 days starting Monday. That affects production of about 40,000 vehicles. Of course, employees will still get paid. We've got major stores closing, but I think the big key here is that it's the small businesses, the medium-sized businesses, that are going to be impacted the most. Right, Mike?
Yeah, I saw a headline this morning saying, retail had been suffering already, and then came coronavirus. What happens next? Boy, I can tell you, tourism right across the country is going to take a huge hit. It's funny because governments are usually publicizing and advertising and trying to get more and more tourists to come across the border. And the last couple of weeks, it's been please stay home, we're canceling everything, don't come. It affects families. It's a huge industry in this country. It's even an industry for my family. My family owns an inn in Ottawa, just down the road from here, and they are basically empty. My brother's been sending me his email, like a sort of a screen grab of his emails.
All right, Mike, we're going to interrupt you now because the Prime Minister is about to speak. Let's listen in now.
Over the past few days, I've spoken to President Trump about what we can do to slow the spread of COVID-19. Deputy Prime Minister Freeland has been in touch with Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo. I just spoke to President Trump again this morning, and we have agreed that both Canada and the United States will temporarily restrict all non-essential travel across the Canada-U.S. border. Je viens de parler au président Trump et nous avons convenu que le Canada et les États-Unis vont interdire temporairement tout passage non essentiel.
Prohibit any non-essential travel across the border for the time being.
Permitted to cross the border for recreation and tourism. In both our countries, we're encouraging people to stay home. We're telling our citizens not to visit their neighbors if they don't absolutely have to. Well, this collaborative and reciprocal measure is an extension of that prudent approach. I want to be clear, though, that essential travel will continue. Our governments recognize that it is critical that we preserve supply chains between both countries. These supply chains ensure that food, fuel, and life-saving medicines reach people on both sides of the border. Supply chains, including trucking, will not be affected by this new measure. Canadians and Americans cross the border every day to do essential work or for other urgent reasons. That will not be impacted. Ces jours-ci, tous les Canadiens ressentent les
Now, all Canadians are feeling the impact of COVID-19. To make sure that you remain safe, we're recommending that everyone work from home. Avoid public places. Buy only what you need in the grocery store. And be kind. Show empathy and compassion to those around you. We must all do our bit to protect our health and those of our loved ones.
COVID-19 is forcing us all to change our ways, and for many people, that's a huge adjustment. If you work in a restaurant, drive a cab, organize events, or freelance to pay your bills, working from home is not so simple. Just like if you work in the oil and gas sector or the tourism and seafood industries, you're looking at the uncertainty in the global economy and probably wondering not only how long this is going to last, but how long your savings are going to last. No matter who you are or what you do, this is a time where you should be focused on your health and that of your neighbors, not whether you're going to lose your job. Not whether you're going to run out of money for things like groceries and medication. Last week, we announced a whole range of measures to protect jobs, small businesses, and the economy, from waiving the waiting period for employment insurance sickness benefits to kick in, to increasing support for employers and businesses. We introduced special measures under the work sharing program to help employers who fall on hard times during COVID-19. And if your business faces a cash crunch, we will help you bridge to better times. We're working with our financial crown corporations through the Business Credit Availability Program to protect jobs and businesses with $10 billion in credit. Mais comme on l'a dit la semaine dernière, ce n'est qu'une première étape.
As we said last week, that's only the first step. When we announced these measures, we said we would be doing more. And this is what brings me to where we are today.
Extraordinary times. Our government is taking extraordinary measures. The measures we're announcing today will provide up to $27 billion in direct support to Canadian workers and businesses, plus $55 billion to meet liquidity needs of Canadian businesses and households through tax deferrals to help stabilize the economy. Combined, this $82 billion in support represents more than 3% of Canada's GDP. Let's start with people who don't qualify for employment insurance. and don't have access to paid sick leave. Our government will introduce the Emergency Care Benefit, which will provide money every 2 weeks to workers who have to stay home. People will receive this benefit for 14 weeks for an amount comparable to what would be paid through EI. This applies to people who fall ill, people who've been placed in quarantine or have to self-isolate. It also applies to those who have to take care of a family member with COVID-19, but, as I said, fail to qualify for EI. If you lose your job and you do not qualify for EI, we will be introducing a COVID-19 emergency support benefit to help you. This will apply also to people who are self-employed and have to close shop because of the virus. Je vais commencer par ce qu'on va faire pour les gens qui ne sont pas admissibles.
So let's start with what we're going to do for people who are not eligible for EI. Our government will create the Emergency Care Benefit, which will provide money to workers who have to remain at home because of COVID-19. This money will be given every 2 weeks. These benefits will last 14 weeks, and the amount is comparable to what will be paid under EI. This measure is designed for people who feel ill, who are in quarantine, or who have to self-isolate as well. It also applies to people who have to take care of a member of their family who's affected by COVID-19, but who are not eligible to EI. If you lose your job, and if you're not eligible for EI, we will create an emergency support benefit to help you. Now, this benefit will also apply to self-employed workers who have to stop working because of the virus.
Economic plan, our government will take additional steps to protect jobs. We will provide employers of small businesses with a temporary wage subsidy equal to 10% of salary paid to employees for a period of 3 months. This will encourage employers to keep staff on the payroll during these uncertain times. Pour protéger les emplois,
to protect jobs, our government will be providing small business owners a temporary wage subsidy equivalent to 10% of the total wage bill for 3 months. Now, this is a measure which will encourage employers to keep their employees on during this time of uncertainty.
And I know a lot of people are wondering what COVID-19 means for their personal finances. For those who've filed their taxes and find out that they owe money, they will have until August 2020 to pay. Si vous faites votre déclaration d'impôt et vous apprenez que vous
This
devez
is tax season, and if you learn that you owe money, you will have up to August 2020 to pay. We're also planning more targeted aid over the coming months for various groups who are most affected by the virus or who are in a vulnerable situation as well. Now, that brings me to the next measure that we're announcing today, which is designed for parents.
Young kids are going to find the coming months especially difficult with school closures and additional childcare responsibilities. Parents already know how much the Canada Child Benefit helps with the costs of raising kids. To take some of that pressure off, our government will temporarily boost the CCB in the coming months. To help
parents get through this tough time, our government will be providing a temporary boost to the Canada Child Benefit over the coming months.
With this plan, we're also going to do more for lower-income people. In May, our government will supplement the GST credit, a tax-free payment sent to low-income Canadians every few months to offset the consumer tax that they pay. Every adult who qualifies will receive up to $300 with $150 for every child. To
help those on low incomes, our government will increase the GST credit. In May, adults who are eligible will receive up to $300 and up to $150 per child.
While all Canadians are feeling the impacts of COVID-19, some groups are particularly vulnerable. For people who are still paying off their student loans, including young people and those who are starting a family, our government will put in place a 6-month interest-free moratorium on their Canada student loans. For people experiencing homelessness, we are doubling the Reaching Home program which provides funding to communities to help them address their local needs. For anyone fleeing domestic or gender-based violence, we will boost funding for shelters that provide sanctuary when self-isolating at home is simply not an option. And to support immediate needs in First Nations, Inuit and Métis Nation communities, we are setting up a distinctions-based Indigenous Community Support Fund. This list is by no means exhaustive, but these are some of the things our government is doing to make sure that no matter where you live, what you do, or who you are, you will get the support you need during this time. In Canada, public health should never hinge on financial considerations. Aujourd'hui, on annonce un plan.
Today, we're announcing a plan to help people. We're focusing on the most pressing needs. But as I've said right from the outset, our response will change as the situation evolves as well. No matter what the future holds for us, Canadians can count on us. Our work is to support you. Our job is to give you a helping hand when you need it most. And this is what we're doing through the measures we've announced to date. And this is what we'll continue to do as well.
I want to turn to additional measures for businesses as part of this economic plan. To help businesses navigate these uncertain economic times, Export Development Canada will provide support to Canadian companies affected by the global situation. For farmers and our primary food producers, we will boost Farm Credit Canada. And we know some sectors of our economy are more vulnerable to COVID-19 than others. That's why in the coming days, we'll be looking at ways in which we can support them all, including through instruments like the Canada account. L'annonce d'aujourd'hui donne suite aux mesures que nous avons déjà prises.
Today's announcement builds on the announcements we've already made to protect our economy and the health of Canadians. Minister Morneau has also obtained a commitment from Canadian banks to support businesses and people affected by COVID-19. I know that he's in regular contact on this file, and he's in contact also with business leaders, union leaders, as well as his international counterparts as well.
Is paying close attention to the economic impacts of decisions we make across the board to slow the spread of this virus. On Monday, I announced that Canada was closing its air borders to people who are not Canadian citizens or permanent residents, with some exceptions. We also announced a range of other measures on travel. But travel restrictions will not apply to commerce or trade. We are working continuously to ensure the supply of important goods to Canada. Today, we've announced $27 billion in direct support to Canadian workers and businesses, plus $55 billion to meet liquidity needs of Canadian businesses and households to help stabilize the economy through tax deferrals. Economic measures will ensure that our economy rebounds after this. And while we are taking a significant step today to help families get through these challenging times, our government is prepared to do more. But whether we're talking about economic, travel, or health measures, collaboration and coordination remains essential. Our team is in constant communication with our colleagues in the provinces and territories, as well as Indigenous leaders and communities, to ensure that we have a coordinated, Canada-wide approach so we face this and recover from this together. We're also working with our international counterparts. Over the last number of days, I've spoken with leaders from around the world, including with fellow G7 leaders. Working together is how we'll get through this, as families, as a community, as a country. Like many of you, over the past few days, I've seen stories of people doing just that, of people donating money to food banks to help those in need, of friends setting up online groups to chat, of retired nurses and doctors stepping up to health, of young people giving a hand to elderly neighbors by dropping off some extra groceries at their door. I have to tell you, it gives me a lot of hope. I want to close by recognizing everyone on the front lines who's doing an incredible job of keeping Canadians safe and healthy. Grocers keeping their shelves full and our families fed. Postal workers helping us stay home. Pharmacists filling our prescriptions. Healthcare professionals caring for our most vulnerable, public health officials and first responders looking out for our safety. I know it's a hard time, but that's exactly why we need to keep supporting each other. Our government is here for you, and your fellow Canadians are here for you too. Merci. Thank you, everyone. Just before we get to questions, I'm supposed to model healthy behavior. I'm going to go grab my coat, and I'll be right back.
Mike Armstrong, let's talk about this. There we go. He's got his coat now.
Direct measures for Canadians and tax deferrals. Now questions. Let's listen in.
Hello, Mr. Trudeau. It's Annie Bergeron-Oliver from CTV National News. I'm just wondering, what assurances do you have from President Trump that if this pandemic gets worse, he will not close the borders, crippling trade and necessary shipments in Canada? And also, how long do you expect this temporary closure to last? Will it be weeks? Are you planning for months?
We talked about exactly that this morning, President Trump and I, to ensure that indeed our economies and our people that are so interconnected in so many different ways will be able to ensure the smooth flow of goods and essential materials and medication across the border. That is something that we remain committed to. We will work in close collaboration on an ongoing basis to make sure that that continues. And these measures will last in place as long as we feel that they need to last. We will, again, closely coordinate on that as well.
Monsieur Trudeau, sur la frontière avec les États-Unis, comment
on the U.S. border, Mr. Trudeau, how can we make sure that those who are able to cross the border don't infect people here in Canada? How can we make sure also that the border remains open for goods and essential products? Could you be as concrete as possible in your answer? And for how long will this be enforced? We're working in a very careful way, deliberate way with the U.S. to put in place the rules that will keep Americans and Canadians safe. We understand to what extent it's important that this border remain open. We're talking about $2 billion in trade per day crossing the border. It's essential, really. It's crucial, in fact, and not just for the health of our economy, but also the health of our citizens as well, that this continue. We will also be making sure that these measures protect Canadians while at the same time allowing the import and export of essential goods. In terms of the length of time it'll be enforced, we'll continue to keep an eye on it. We'll keep it in place as long as it needs to be in place, but we'll coordinate between our two countries.
Prime Minister, with all these economic measures being announced, is it inevitable that we're heading into a recession?
I think right now we are focused on making sure that people who are not getting income or revenue because of this COVID-19 challenge have the money to be able to pay for groceries, to pay their rent, to support their families through this difficult time. We recognize that many businesses are closed, many workplaces have significant slowdowns, if not stoppages, and that is going to have an economic impact. But we also know that the fundamentals of the Canadian economy are strong. And in a number of weeks or a number of months or however long it takes, once we get rolling again, the capacity of the federal government to invest in the economy, to support businesses and individuals, will ensure that we bounce back strongly. We have the fiscal room to do this because of prudent decision-making over the past 5 years. We will be able to ensure that our economy gets back up to speed very quickly.
Guillaume Saint-Pierre, Journal de Montréal. Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Hello, Mr. Trudeau. Today you're announcing billions in dollars in aid for Canadians. I'm sure it's much easier to announce it than actually to do it. When will Canadians who need this money actually get it? We're talking about weeks. A couple of weeks for checks to be sent out, especially for those people who are not eligible for EI. There are legislative measures that will have to be taken as well. We're working with the other parties on this, and they're cooperating fully so that we can actually pass the necessary legislation in the House of Commons so we're able to actually get the money out the door. But the work is starting now. It will start even before the House is reconvened so that we can get this money out the door as quickly as possible when people actually need it.
Forrest Politico. Prime Minister, yesterday you talked about the possibility of invoking the Emergencies Act. Today you're saying that the Canada-U.S. border will be closed to non-essential travel. How close are you at this point to imposing restrictions across Canada? And specifically, are you considering limiting travel within Canada as well?
I have said time and time again that we are looking at all options. We're not taking any options off the table. Every day we've been announcing new measures that we've been able to move forward on, and we will continue to look at measures as they become necessary and the tools that exist to make those measures necessary. I will highlight, of course, that the Emergency Measures Act is a significant step, not one that we feel we need today, but not one that we are closing the door to in the future if necessary. Okay. Nous annonçons aujourd'hui des mesures.
Today we've announced measures, and every day, in fact, we've been announcing additional measures. To date, we have the necessary authority to announce the measures that we need to actually put in place. Nothing is off the table, of course. There are other tools that we could use. The Emergency Measures Act, for example, would be a serious step, of course. For as long as we don't need it, we intend not to use it, in fact. But we are considering the fact that it might be necessary at one point. But to date, we're using all the tools we have to keep people safe.
You rolled out or talked about a lot of economic and stimulus measures that you're planning to put in force. What kind of reassurances can you give to Canadians at this time that the government has the infrastructure in place and the people in place, considering the directive to work from home, that this money will roll out in a timely and efficient manner?
There are many families across this country who are looking at their sources of income dry up because of COVID-19. Many of them qualify for EI. Many workers qualify for EI, and we're making sure that with the elimination of the one-week waiting period, that money will be able to flow significantly and quickly to them. Many families do not qualify for EI. Many workers do not qualify for EI, and therefore we're putting in place exceptional measures that will flow money to them every 2 weeks. Our capacity to do this is something that we have spent a lot of time over the past days ensuring, because we know that that could make the difference not just between one family facing tougher times or not, but it could make a difference on the health of all Canadians. People need to be able to self-isolate, need to be able to stay home, need to be able to care for their families when their ordinary sources of revenue dry up. That is why we're putting forward $27 million in direct supports to Canadians and businesses. That is why we are moving forward on freeing up $55 billion that will stay in the economy because of delayed tax payments to make sure that people can cover the things they need to in the coming days, along with all our extra measures for shelters, for Indigenous communities, through the Canada Child Benefit and others that will ensure that Canadians have the confidence that they will be okay through this difficult time, because we are all in this together and we are there for you.
On va maintenant passer aux journalistes qui sont sur la ligne. Modérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Merci. The first question is from Lina Dib de la presse canadienne. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. BC has been asking for you to close the border. They started asking for that last week. You've seen the number of cases in Washington State. You've seen the number increase yesterday. Why did you fail to close the border earlier? And do you believe that you perhaps acted too late, especially for BC? Well, we've taken We took, in fact, major steps on Monday to close our borders to international travels. We only took 2 days to coordinate our approach with the U.S. to ensure that we close the border in the right way and in consultation with the other country. Vice Prime Minister Freeland called Vice President Pence yesterday to start the discussions, the final phase of the discussions, in fact. And today we're making an announcement, and we know this will really help a lot of people across the country.
We recognize that we took some significant steps over the past few days. We closed the borders to overseas travel on Monday, and today, 2 days later, we announce that we are restricting non-essential travel between Canada and the United States. This is something that we've been coordinating with the United States on over the past days. Yesterday, Deputy Prime Minister Freeland reached out to Vice President Pence to really advance these negotiations, and we're able to announce it in a coordinated fashion on both sides of the border this morning. This is something that we need to move forward on to protect Canadians.
Parfait, on va passer à la prochaine question, modérateur.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from Bill Curry from the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, Prime Minister. We're seeing in the United States some lawmakers are discussing the possibility of sending direct checks to all Americans as a way of you sacrifice targeting those most in need, but the benefit is it gets there faster. And so you've gone with some existing programs that might involve people kind of dealing with the government and applying for these programs that could sacrifice speed. So can you talk about your thought process in going with this route as opposed to something like direct checks that might be simpler?
I know the finance minister is about to give a press conference in which he will answer many of these questions, but I can say that we are confident that getting these measures out, particularly around EI and folks who don't qualify for EI within the next few weeks to compensate for lost income is going to make a significant difference to people who had an income but have seen it dry up over these days because of COVID-19. Many people on pensions or benefits or supports of various types will of course still receive those supports. We really wanted to target those people who would lose their income specifically. We've also put on the table significant support for businesses and employers to be able to support their workers, to be able to support their fellow Canadians. These are the kinds of things that we're moving with, both quickly and in a targeted fashion, because that's what Canadians expect.
Merci beaucoup. Modérateur, on va passer à la prochaine question.
Merci. Thank you. The next question is from Mélanie Marquis from La Presse. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Hello, Mr. Trudeau. On the border, could you tell us when the border will start, when the closure will actually come into force? And could you tell us how you intend to actually monitor this border closure? Will you be hiring new customs officers? Will you be using the army, for example? Now, also a second question on the border at Roxham Road. There are people who are crossing the border irregularly. What are you going to do about that situation? Well, first of all, we're working with the U.S. To ensure that these measures come into force as quickly as possible. We'll have further announcements to make later. We'll tell you exactly when it'll come into force, but it's going to be very, very quickly. I'd also like to point out that we have taken steps to ensure that non-essential travellers are unable to cross the border. The CBSA has the necessary resources to meet this challenge. Many people will, in fact, choose to stay at home. They won't even try to cross the border if they're told not to. Now, on Roxham Road, I'd like to reassure you by saying that we've taken the necessary steps to make sure that full controls are in place and everybody crossing at Roxham Road will be in quarantine for 14 days.
Modérateur, dernière question.
Merci. Thank you. The next question is from Heather Schofield from the Toronto Star. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Good morning, Prime Minister. In terms of working with the opposition and having to pass some of these steps through them, have you been in touch with the opposition leaders, and do you have their assurance that they will cooperate with you to move quickly?
Our House leaders have been working together very closely, both on the House side and on the Senate side. Minister Pablo Rodriguez and Senator Mark Gold have been engaged with all party leaders, both in the House and the Senate. There is broad collaboration. There is broad openness to moving these measures quickly that will help Canadians who need it. I am confident that this is a moment in which Canadians of all parties will pull together to ensure Canadians get the help they need. Minister
Rodriguez and Senator Mark Gold are working with their counterparts from the other parties to make sure that we can get these measures through Parliament as quickly as possible. I can tell you that there's goodwill being shown by the opposition parties to help Canadians, and we're quite confident that it will get through very quickly. Personally speaking, things are going well. My kids are fine. I don't yet have symptoms. So great there. Sophie is she's got flu, she's got a headache, she's got intermittent fever, but she's doing pretty well. And thank you very much for your kind thoughts. Thank you to all of you.
That is the Prime Minister addressing the nation on the latest with the federal plans. And as he described it, these are extraordinary times, and he is taking extraordinary measures. We're talking about an $82 billion economic package in 2 phases, $27 billion directly to businesses and $55 billion to help with things like employment insurance and the tax season. Let's bring in Mike Armstrong, who's been watching this news conference as well. Let's break down the key points of how this money is going to work.
Yeah, it is a lot of money being handed out in a very short amount of time. Emergency care benefits up to $10 million, emergency support benefits up to $5 billion, additional GST credits. So that's the check people get back to help them cover some of the cost of GST, $5.5 billion. It is just a very, very long list, which I'm sure we'll put up on the Global website if people want to look at the whole thing. But the Prime Minister said it is extremely important, this is the way he put it, to get the money out the door as quickly as possible so that Canadians can worry about their family and their health instead of worrying about how they're going to put food on the table.
He also seemed to indicate that this was a plan that was in place for months, so they're getting ready for this to be a long haul.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting. The chart that I'm looking at here actually mentions which of these measures now require royal assent. So legislative measures that have to be approved in the building behind me on Parliament Hill. Actually, the building to the side, because that one's under construction. But these are rules that, changes that will require legislative changes. And so they're going to be bringing back MPs. Not all of the MPs. Instead of 335 MPs, I believe it is, they only need 20 for quorum. And you heard him right at the end of that press conference talking a little bit about how there has been a lot of cooperation with the other parties to try and move these things through. And as we said, get this money into the hands of Canadians quickly.
So today's announcement is twofold. We're talking about the economic stimulus package, but we're also talking about limiting travel between Canada and the U.S. This is really unprecedented that 2 allies are agreeing to this. What are we talking about here?
Well, the Prime Minister said he's been speaking to President Trump, as well as the Deputy Prime Minister has been speaking to the Vice President. Like, there has been a negotiation ongoing for days. He said the Prime Minister actually said he spoke to the President as recently as this morning. So they're going to restrict all non-essential travel across the border in both countries. He said we've been encouraging people to stay at home to slow the transmission. This is an extension of that approach. We want people to stay where they are. But at the same time, it's critical that the supply routes stay open. Trucking will not be affected in this, as well as Canadians who cross the border every day for essential work will not be affected. He said these measures will last, quote, as long as they need to last. We don't know. But it is interesting. Like, it is such a huge thing to close the border like this. If you look back to the last time that I remember the border being closed, 9/11, the border never sort of rebounded to where it was prior to 9/11. Afterwards, it always stayed a sort of a more rigid border. It'll be interesting to see how things change or whether things change down the road when we finally come out of this crisis.
This is the third day that the Prime Minister has addressed the nation. Earlier in the week, we talked about limiting international travel. People who are not Canadian citizens, not permanent residents, they will not be allowed to come here. They're talking about now limiting travel between the U.S. and Canada. The question one reporter put to the Prime Minister is, when is domestic travel next? What was his answer for that?
Well, that would probably require the federal government to enact the Emergencies Act, formerly the Emergency Measures Act. Prior to 1988, I believe it was the War Measures Act. The government is trying to avoid that. We heard over and over from cabinet ministers saying that that is very much the last resort. They don't want to get to the point where that is needed, where the powers that are granted under that act are needed. Among the powers that it would give the federal government, the ability to sort of limit movement, close down areas of the country, things like that. Possibly very important measures that could come in handy as we try to flatten the curve. But again, the Prime Minister today said it is not something he wants to do. It is not something that at this point they feel they need to do. But it is certainly, and we've heard this over and over, it's not off the table.
Okay, Mike Armstrong in Ottawa, thank you for that. Let's go to Global's Richard Zussman, who's in Victoria, BC. He's our political correspondent there. Richard, let's talk about what the BC government wanted the federal government to do earlier, banning the U.S. from coming here because of the cases in Washington state.
Yeah, Robin, as you know, BC's economy and movement is so intrinsically linked to Washington state. And when the Prime Minister announced earlier this week that the borders would remain open, in essence, for American tourists, there was high concern from Premier John Horgan and BC's Health Minister Adrian Dix. At that point, they said, Americans stay home. Do not come here. We know the borders are still open, but do not come. The main reason is because of the outbreaks we are seeing in King and Snohomish County. Those are in the Seattle area. And Health Minister Adrian Dix said those concerns are just so high, and the BC government was adamant that these borders be shut down, and the Premier made that clear to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau over the last few days, and obviously was part of the discussions that were happening between the U.S. and Canadian governments.
Richard, we saw a significant spike in cases in BC yesterday. We're probably going to get more announcements today. The big key and the big concern for our public health officials here is that the testing kits are so limited.
And that's one of the things that they are continuing to work on. And we've heard the message over and over again from BC Chief Medical Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry. Do not come get tested if you do not feel sick. The province is continuing to make the rules more stringent around who gets tested and when they get tested. We're also seeing an increase in the number of deaths here in British Columbia. An increase of 7 yesterday, now 8 total deaths in British Columbia from COVID-19. Most of those, Robin, are linked to a care home in North Vancouver, the Lynn Valley Care Center, but the province is very closely monitoring, obviously, the increase in cases, the increases in deaths, and trying to ensure that they have the proper resources needed for testing. There's no real concern at this point they will run out of resources, but they are concerned about the supply. They are also bringing in additional equipment, including respiratory masks.
Richard Zussman in Victoria, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Let's
Robin.
go to Sean O'Shea. He's at the Canadian side of the border near the Whirlpool Bridge in Niagara Falls, Ontario. Sean, what's the impact been on the border there since the COVID-19 crisis began? Sean, you're at the border right now. We know that activity has been quite limited since COVID-19 began. What's it like today?
Well, it's been, as I said earlier in the broadcast, there have been fewer people going across. I spoke to the mayor of Niagara Falls, Jim Diodati, and asked him what he thinks of this decision, and he said about time. He said that this should have happened sooner. There's no reason for people coming across into Niagara Falls or into Canada now for pleasure purposes. And bear in mind, this is a community that is almost entirely dependent on tourism. But the mayor said no place for it, and we're happy to see this. There are still people, though, as I mentioned earlier, who come back and forth, go back and forth between Niagara Falls, Ontario, and Niagara Falls, New York. There's a New York plate just going across the bridge here just now. So there is an interconnectivity between these two communities, and the question is, to what extent that is now going to be affected.
How do you monitor that, though? Because I'm sure there are Canadians who live on that side of the border as well. This is where there are a lot of questions that need to be answered.
Yes, and we expect, we've calls into border security to find out how they're going to deal with that. At the Nexus Bridge, it's a little bit different because people's profiles, what they do for a living, all of those things, people are pre-cleared here. And I'm sure they'll still be asking these additional questions because usually there aren't a lot of questions asked at a Nexus Bridge. 4 bridges down here, lots of commercial traffic at 2 of them. 2 of the other bridges, including this one, are strictly people that are going back and forth, not for commercial purposes, or not hauling freight or anything like that. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time for people to figure this out. But as I said, the mayor here and local officials who are in emergency measures planning session as we speak are happy that this action is being taken by the Prime Minister and the federal government.
All right, Sean O'Shea in the Niagara, Ontario region. Thank you so much. Finance Minister Bill Morneau is set to speak shortly, and we'll let you know when that happens. But let's go back to Mike Armstrong, our senior national correspondent. He's in Ottawa, and he's been watching all the developments this whole week. Mike, let's talk about this $55 billion, $27 billion package. It makes a total of $82 billion. How quickly are Canadians going to see money in their pockets from the federal government?
Much of it, the Prime Minister said, would take a couple of weeks. Other parts of it might take a little bit longer, things that need legislative changes, so they do have to bring MPs back, have it voted on and approved. So that will take perhaps a bit more time. But it is very clear that the Prime Minister said they want to get that money out the door as quickly as possible. He also mentioned that they've had good cooperation between the House leaders, the different parties in Parliament. There's been broad collaboration, he said, to move these measures ahead quickly.
2 key groups that we are trying to help here are obviously temporary workers who aren't regular staff members. He said he wanted to make sure that restaurants and bars keep their staff on the payroll for at least 3 months, which means it's going to be a long time.
Yeah, there is a temporary wage supplement for businesses, sort of an incentive so that companies keep paying their workers. It's supposed to be up to 10% of the workers' salaries. There are a lot of different measures that have been announced today. We're going to be running a deficit next year, much bigger than what was planned, that's for darn sure.
All right, let's talk about sick leave. People who are in self-isolation, he's obviously providing compensation for them because they may not have benefits for that.
If you drive a cab or something like that and you're not on the road, you're no longer collecting money. So the Prime Minister talked about trying to have an emergency care benefit for people who don't qualify for paid leave. It's actually the more vulnerable people in society, too, that are less likely to have access to paid leave. The more you make, the more likely you are your company will give you paid leave. So there's an emergency benefit for people who are forced out of work or people who are self-employed. There's that temporary wage benefit where they're trying to keep people on the payrolls. They really are trying to target more vulnerable groups as well. He went through a list. It was parents who are dealing with school closures, childcare. They're going to boost the childcare benefit in the coming months. Student loans, which is a question we've been hearing about. There's going to be a 6-month interest-free moratorium. The homeless in society from coast to coast, obviously a problem. They're going to be doubling the Reaching Home programs, something that's trying to get people off the streets. Victims of domestic violence, there's more money for shelters. Indigenous communities across the country, there's an increase to the support fund. And there are also economic measures that they hope will help us rebound as we come out of this crisis.
Another thing, it's tax season. What's he doing to help that situation?
We did hear about that. We've been waiting for it. It looks like the deadline was April 30th for people to get their taxes in. It is now being moved to June 1st. And the deadline for people to pay their taxes if they still owe will be, I believe it's July 31st, somewhere in there. A lot of different documents in front of me this morning. But it's interesting. Quebec actually did this over the weekend, moved that deadline, but it came with a disclaimer. The earlier you get your return in, the quicker you'll likely get your refund. So even though you can wait longer, you might not want to wait longer.
Mike, one final question. I want to ask you about the tone that the Prime Minister had. Did you find it measured? Did you find that it was providing comfort to Canadians?
I missed the question there, Robin. I apologize.
Just want to ask you about the tone of the news conference, the Prime Minister's tone. Did you find it was measured? Did you find that he was providing comfort for Canadians?
That is certainly something he's been trying to do throughout this. He's trying to project calm, concern also, and I think he's trying to, on a daily basis, make sure that Canadians look out for other Canadians. That's certainly something he's talked about. He also mentioned again healthcare workers, people that are on the front lines in this, and how appreciative he is for what they're doing. By the way, he's also seen that up close because his wife, Sophie Trudeau, is actually in quarantine. He did update her health a little bit, saying she's showing some flu-like symptoms, a fever, coughing, but doing okay, he said. And the rest of the family is still in self-isolation throughout this as well.
All right, Mike. Mike Armstrong in Ottawa. Let's go to our other Ottawa correspondent, Abigail Beeman. She's in Ottawa as well. Abigail, how wide-ranging is this?
I think that's something important to talk about. The measures announced, the Prime Minister was explicit in mentioning this is worth 3% of the country's GDP. So a lot, or wide-ranging in a nutshell. But it was interesting to me to see exactly how wide-ranging these were in terms of support. So specific support for people who can't access EI or don't have access to paid sick leave. The press release that came out following the Prime Minister's comments from the Prime Minister's office was also very careful to lay out, exactly who this can apply to. So we're talking about 15 weeks of extra help in terms of the exact name of the program escapes me. I think the emergency care benefit package. So a caregiver for somebody who is in quarantine or who is sick, somebody who's been required to self-isolate but doesn't have access to paid sick leave. There's a lot there. Something else interesting that struck me were, of course, hearing from a lot of small businesses who are very anxious or who are already have been forced to close, who are concerned here. And something that stood out to me was this 15-week payroll subsidy, 3 months payroll subsidy, so that small businesses are encouraged to keep people on the payroll with this extra help rather than having to fire people. So wide-ranging, a lot of people that this support is aiming to help. The question is, how easy is it going to be to access? How easy is it going to be to roll out and to get that help? But what's announced today should help a lot of people.
Ever since this COVID-19 crisis has affected us, we've seen the markets swing back and forth, very volatile. The Prime Minister was asked if there is going to be a recession. Are we preparing for a recession? What was his answer to that?
Well, his answer was that he's focused on how to help Canadians, so certainly wasn't prepared to come right out and address that recession question head on. As you mentioned, we're waiting to hear from the Finance Minister, and I'm sure the Finance Minister will be asked that question as well. But when you see everything that's being put on the table, and again, 3% of Canada's GDP.
All right, Abigail, we're actually hearing the Finance Minister right now, so we're going to have to cut you off and go to Bill Morneau. Let's listen in.
By acknowledging the diligence of frontline healthcare workers who are treating patients and the public healthcare providers who are working tirelessly to slow the spread of this disease, this virus. They've worked extremely hard in recent times to prepare our country as we pull together. Last week, we announced funding to make sure our provinces and our territories have everything necessary in order to protect Canadians and make sure that the federal government was doing everything that it could. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the countless others who are helping us to get through a very challenging time. Across the country, cleaners and janitors are keeping spaces clean and disinfected. At grocery stores and at pharmacies, people are working hard to restock shelves and manage difficult situations. IT and telecom workers are making sure that our networks are functioning well as more and more Canadians work from home. Truckers, rail workers, air cargo workers, and postal workers are working to make sure that we have the essential goods that we need. At food banks and at shelters, Workers are facing growing uncertainty with dedication and with a sense of duty. There are countless others who, in these difficult times, have showed immense patience and determination in making sure that Canadians have the goods and services that they need. So I want to thank all of you for all that you're doing. The health and safety of Canadians is our government's top priority. We continue to urge Canadians to stay home and to follow the advice from medical professionals and from public health officials. Please take all necessary precautions to protect your health. It's not just about you. It's about your neighbors. It's about your colleagues. It's about your family members. La santé et la sécurité des Canadiens et des Canadiennes sont la priorité absolue.
The absolute priority of our government.
D'insister.
We continue to insist that all Canadians who can stay at home do so, and that everyone follow the directives from medical authorities and health authorities. Please take all necessary precautions to protect your health. We're not just talking about you. This is about your neighbors, your colleagues, and the members of your family.
To flatten the curve and to protect those who are most vulnerable. We have to look out for each other. That's what Canadians do. We need that Canadian spirit now, more than ever. COVID-19 is having a significant impact on our economy, an impact that continues to evolve. At this stage, the full breadth and the scope of the impact remain unknown. I want to acknowledge the Prime Minister's leadership. This is a challenge like none that we've ever faced before. Facing up to it demands swift and decisive action. A coordinated approach is absolutely necessary at this time. I'm in contact with provincial and territorial partners, with the private sector, and with my colleagues, other finance ministers from around the world. I've also been working very closely with federal colleagues, including Governor Polas from the Bank of Canada, who's here with me today. Together, we're working hard to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 on the Canadian and on the global economy. Clearly, the impacts of this pandemic have been profound and will continue to be profound. Households and businesses are already feeling the effects. Our government is prepared to do whatever it takes to keep our economy strong and stable, whatever it takes. I want to address something off the top. Usually my job is to ensure that we maintain our fiscal track. But right now, as Minister of Finance, my only job is to make sure that Canadians can keep food in the fridge, that they can keep a roof over their heads, that they can afford the medicine that they need. As you've heard me say many times before, we've entered this challenge in a very strong fiscal position. Canada's balance sheet is the envy of the world, and it means we have the fiscal firepower to respond. We're now prepared to use it. COVID-19 is an extraordinary challenge that requires an extraordinary investment. Today, we're announcing the first phase of Canada's COVID-19 economic response plan. We'll provide $27 billion of direct support to people and businesses, which is more than 1% of our GDP. On top of this, we'll defer $55 billion in tax revenue, leaving that money in the economy. For the economists listening, that's 3% of GDP that would not be in the economy without these actions. For all Canadians, this means we're doing whatever it takes to support you and your family as we contain this virus. Aujourd'hui, nous annonçons la...
Today, we are announcing the first phase of our intervention plan to respond to COVID-19. We will provide $27 billion in direct aid to individuals and businesses, which will represents close to 3% of the GDP. In addition, we will inject $55 billion to deferring that as tax revenues. And for the economists of you out there, that represents 3% of the GDP, which we will leave in the economy. For Canadians, this means that we are doing everything in our power to support you. And so we will continue to do so.
To people's hands, so that no matter what happens during this period, they can afford the essentials. And we're working to make sure that no one gets left behind. First and foremost, we know that people are worried about their health. So if you're needing to quarantine or to self-isolate or care for a loved one who's sick, you can get around $450 per week, even if you don't qualify for employment insurance. The new, what we're calling emergency care benefit, will provide self-employed Canadians, contractors, freelancers, part-time workers, gig economy workers, many of our cultural workers and more, with income security if they can't work because they're in self-isolation or in quarantine or taking care of a loved one. This benefit will provide income support of $900 every 2 weeks for up to 15 weeks. La nouvelle allocation de soins d'urgence,
the new emergency care benefit, will allow business people, independent workers, freelancers, and part-time workers, and many of our cultural workers, income security if they are unable to work because they are in isolation or quarantine, or because they are taking care of their family. This benefit will result in a benefit of $900 every 2 weeks for up until 15 weeks.
Able to work because schools and daycares are closed, or if you need to take care of a sick family member, you'll also qualify for the emergency care benefit. Canadians can apply online at home, allowing them to follow public health guidelines, and they can receive payment via direct deposit. It will require a simple attestation that will not require medical documentation. We want this to be as easy as possible so that people who need this help can get this help. The benefit will be available starting in early April. This is about saving lives. No Canadian will have to worry about protecting their health and putting food on the table. This new measure builds on the announcement the Prime Minister made last week that we're waiving the 1-week waiting period to access the employment insurance sickness benefits for people who are sick or in quarantine. We also know that people are worried about struggling to pay the bills if they lose their jobs or see their hours reduced. We want you to know that we have your back. For any worker who loses their job and does not qualify for employment insurance, we'll be introducing a new benefit, the Emergency Support Benefit, for which we've set aside $5 billion. More details will come in the near future, but you can rest assured that the federal government will provide you with 14 weeks of support at a comparable level to the employment insurance program. There are also over 12 million Canadian families with low and modest incomes who will need extra financial support at this time. The government will provide a GST credit averaging close to $400 for single adults and $600 for couples to see you through. And to help families keep their kids well fed and provided for, the government will issue a special Canada Child benefit top-up of $300 per child. For a single parent with 2 children earning minimum wage, these two measures combined will mean around $1,500 of special support.
For workers who lose their jobs and who are not eligible for EI, we are going to introduce a new benefit called the Emergency Support Benefit, for which we have set aside $5 billion. More details will follow in the near future, but you can rest assured that the federal government will provide 14 weeks of support at a comparable level to employment insurance. Over 12 million low and modest income families in Canada need financial support. The government will thus provide a GST top-up of some $400 for lone adults and close to $600 for couples. And to help families look after their children, the government will provide a Canada Child benefit top-up of some $300 per child. For a lone parent with 2 children who earns minimum wage, these two combined measures will represent some $1,500 of support.
Seniors are worried too. First and foremost, Please take care of your health, practice social distancing, and make sure you're listening to medical advice. We also know you're concerned about the impact of recent market volatility on your retirement funds. We will help you protect the value of your retirement fund by temporarily reducing the minimum withdrawal on registered retirement income funds by 25%. We'll continue to monitor this issue as markets evolve. And I want to assure you that your OAS and GIS payments will continue as usual, without any interruption. Many young Canadians who are starting out in their careers are worried about what this uncertainty will mean to their finances. We're putting in place a 6-month interest-free moratorium on Canada student loan paybacks. This means nearly 1 million Canadians will have an extra $160 a month during this period. We know that Indigenous communities face a greater risk of financial insecurity, so we're creating a distinctions-based Indigenous Community Support Fund. It's crucial that we support our most vulnerable at this time. And that, of course, has to include shelters. Shelters across the country will need the tools to prevent outbreaks. So we'll invest over $200 million to support the homeless through homeless shelters, sexual assault centers, and shelters for women and children to help with the purchase of necessary equipment to implement the best medical advice for keeping people safe and healthy. Partout au pays,
across the country, shelters will need resources to prevent outbreaks. We will invest close to $200 million to support shelters for the homeless, sexual assault centers, and halfway homes and transition homes for women and children so that they can do everything that they can to put in place the best medical advice to ensure the health and safety of Canadians.
We need businesses to keep going so that they can keep employees on staff. I know many small and medium-sized businesses and organizations are very concerned about their ability to keep paying their workers. For small employers, we will provide a 10% wage subsidy for the next 3 months, up to $25,000 per employer. This is effective immediately and will help keep Canadians employed. Je sais que de nombreuses petites et moyennes.
I know that many small and medium-sized businesses are very concerned about their ability to continue to pay their workers. For small businesses and organizations, we will provide a wage subsidy of 10% for the next 3 months, up to an amount of $25,000 per employer. This will come into force immediately, and this will help keep Canadians at work.
To enhance the work-sharing program, which will help workers facing reduced hours to get by and help businesses and employers in these difficult times. We also announced Business Credit Availability Program, which will provide $10 billion in credit support through the Business Development Bank of Canada and Export Development Canada to help businesses and organizations get the financing that they need to keep operating and to keep their employees on. We're prepared to provide additional financial support as necessary. On Friday, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions took action to free up $300 billion in lending capacity. The Bank of Canada, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, also announced a rate cut of 50 basis points to stabilize our economy. We know that businesses in some sectors are more affected than others, like air transportation and the oil and gas sector, and we know that they will need specific help. EDC and BDC are currently developing a tailored set of tools for them and for other affected sectors. At the same time, the federal government will begin working with the Government of Alberta on support for workers in the oil and gas sector. We'll make a significant investment in orphan well remediation to help both companies and workers in the province. And we'll be ready to make an announcement on this in the coming days. Canadians are also worried, of course, about bills that are coming due. On Monday, the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation reinstated the Insured Mortgage Protection Program. Through this program, the corporation will offer $50 billion so that banks and mortgage lenders can offer Canadians payment deferrals special payment arrangements, or other options to assist homeowners through this time. Compounded with other liquidity tools that we've mentioned, this will mean that there's now $500 billion in credit available to Canadian businesses and households. I've also been talking to the heads of Canada's largest banks, and they've committed to me that they will work with individuals and with businesses on a case-by-case basis to provide additional flexibility in the face of hardships. As a first step, this support will include up to a 6-month deferral program for mortgages and specific opportunities for relief on other credit products, like skip a payment on auto loans or on credit cards. Our banks have a long history of standing by Canadians through challenging times. I encourage Canadians to contact your bank directly to discuss your situation and to get the help that you need. J'ai également parlé aux dirigeants.
I've also been speaking with the heads of major Canadian banks and have encouraged them to work with businesses and individuals to find practical solutions given this context. First, this support will allow for a 6-month deferral for mortgage loans and the possibility of easing credit. Our banks have always supported Canadians throughout difficult times, and I would encourage Canadians to communicate directly with their banks to discuss their situations and to obtain the support that you need.
Personal income taxes and Canadian businesses who owe corporate income tax now only need to pay it before September 1st. This frees up $55 billion in temporary tax relief, and it keeps that money circulating in our economy. We know this is a time when individuals and businesses need to have money at hand. And also, given the extraordinary times, we've extended the tax filing deadline until June 1st. Les Canadiens qui doivent
Canadians who must pay taxes on personal income and Canadian corporations that owe corporate income will not have to pay until September 1st. That frees up $55 million of tax relief and allows this money to circulate freely in our economy. We know that this is a time when individuals and businesses need readily available money. Furthermore, given these extraordinary times, we have extended the deadline for filing tax returns until June 1st.
With Labour and other leaders across Canada. On Monday, I spoke to all of the CEOs of our major grocery stores. They've told me that their supply chains are still working well, and they've committed to me that during this crisis, they will maintain fair prices for their customers. As a reminder to Canadians, when you're out shopping, please make sure that you're leaving goods on the shelves for your neighbors who might be waiting for a check to come before they can buy the things that they need. We all need to pull together and to do our part during this time. And I want to say that this work is just beginning. As your Minister of Finance, I will do whatever it takes. In order to follow through on these commitments, we'll be tabling emergency legislation to provide timely support to Canadians, as well as to ensure that we have all the tools to support them and businesses as things continue to evolve during these very uncertain times. It's our collective responsibility to ensure we continue to have the tools to respond quickly as things evolve. These tools will be essential to give Canadians the certainty that their government can rapidly implement measures to protect them and to protect our economy. I'm calling on all parties and the Senate to work with us and to support this legislation. There can be no delay. But I also want to say that I'm confident that all parliamentarians will rise to this occasion. Canadians are counting on us. I want to turn it over now to Governor Polas for a moment before I make some closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Minister. Bonjour tout le monde.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Expect their policymakers to do what it takes to support them in this difficult period. The circumstances that we face today require all hands on deck. Each institution is acting within its respective mandate to deliver a powerful confidence-boosting package of measures for consumers, business, and financial markets. For its part, the Bank of Canada has been working hard to ensure that the financial system has sufficient liquidity so that credit continues to be available to businesses and to households. To recap briefly, on Monday, the bank adjusted its liquidity operations to maintain market functioning and credit availability. The bank has broadened eligible collateral for its term repo facility to help maintain funding conditions by providing a backstop to regular private funding. These will complement the reduction in bank capital buffers announced last week by the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. All of these actions will support lending by banks to consumers and companies. The bank is also providing extra support to the Canada mortgage bond market so that this important funding market continues to function well. The first purchase under this new program took place only yesterday. To help the economy cope with the negative shocks of COVID-19 and the recent sharp drop in oil prices, the bank has reduced its benchmark interest rate by 100 basis points in 2 steps. The first was on March 4th, second time just this past Friday. Our benchmark interest rate now stands at 0.75%. The bank has also broadened the scope of the Government of Canada bond buyback program, added new term repo operations, and introduced a new banker's acceptance purchase facility that starts next Monday, March the 23rd. In the days to come, the bank will launch its new standing term liquidity facility. This new funding mechanism is focused on individual financial institutions rather than on the market as a whole. It's intended to give an eligible institution that is viable but facing a sudden stress to its liquidity access to central bank liquidity on terms that are known in advance. The Governing Council hopes that institutions facing liquidity issues will make use of this new facility. Canadian banks also conduct parts of their business in U.S. dollars. And on the weekend, the Bank of Canada joined with its counterparts in the UK, Japan, Europe, the U.S., and Switzerland on a coordinated action to provide liquidity via standing U.S. dollar liquidity swap line arrangements. La Banque du Canada mène des actions.
The Bank of Canada is undertaking concerted actions to support the Canadian economy in this time of economic stress. We have introduced these new measures, and we are monitoring how the markets are improving. We are also closely monitoring market trends, and we are prepared to provide all the liquidity that the financial system requires so that it can continue to serve Canadians.
Concerted action to support the Canadian economy during this period of economic stress. We've introduced these new measures, and we're watching how market performance improves. We're closely monitoring market developments, and we stand ready to provide all the liquidity the financial system needs so that it can continue to serve Canadians. Minister, back to you.
Well, thank you. Earlier, I noted that many of the heroes of this situation, the people providing medical care we need, food to eat, working phones and internet, clean spaces, let's make sure that we give them the support that they need. Journalists are also doing extraordinary work to keep Canadians informed in this rapidly changing situation. I do want to note the work of Governor Polas, my colleagues, especially the Prime Minister, who's reacted to this unprecedented situation with strong leadership, compassion, and a focus on taking concrete actions to help Canadians. There are, though, still many things that we do not know. But we do know one thing, and that is that together we will get through this challenge. Lorsque le moment sera venu,
when the time comes, we will ensure more longer-term investments to help Canadians to get their daily life back. But what is the most important thing today is that we take care of each other, that we protect the most vulnerable among us, and that we continue to use all the tools available to stabilize our economy. The government will be there with you at every stage.
Only a first step in our plan. When the time is right, We will announce more long-term investments to assist with recovery and help Canadians get back to their daily lives. But what matters most today is that we look after each other, that we protect those who are most vulnerable, and that we continue to use all of the tools we have to stabilize our economy. The government will be there with you every step along the way. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions from the journalists here.
Hi everyone, so we will be working lots of 3 questions. We'll start by 3 questions in the room, then we'll go to the phone and come back. Oh, thank you. Where's your hand up as well? There you go. So I'll just point, sorry, let's start here. Oops. Yeah, go ahead. You have them.
Kelsey Johnson with Reuters. Governor Poola's first question to you. The Federal Reserve over the weekend cut by 100 basis points to essentially make their rate 0. Why is the Bank of Canada not matching the Federal Reserve's rate cut at this point?
Well, as is always the case, we have independent monetary policies on the two sides of the border. We were anxious to see the details of the fiscal policy that was just announced for you. We'll be taking those actions fully into account in our estimates of how the economy will fare. I will say that one of the most desirable features of these actions today are that they are what I would call elastic. I hope you don't mind, Minister, if I coin a phrase, but what I think they're designed to do is to expand or not, depending on how large of an impact there is on the economy, how many people are affected. And so that's a very desirable feature, and that's something we need to model in. We're updating our forecasts as we speak. Bank staff are fully engaged. Even though they're remote working from home, our systems are functioning very well, and 1,500 people are logged on our systems remotely. And so April 15th is our next announcement date. So I'd like to have the full benefit of the analysis, especially, as I said, incorporating the fiscal response into that analysis. And so for now, that's what I'll say about interest rates.
Morneau, you mentioned that EDC is working on specific packages for industries that will be particularly hard hit, like airlines. Can you give a bit more detail as to what that package may look like, how long it may take to get that package in place? Because as you mentioned, there are significant industries that are in a crisis point at this point.
Well, let me step to the broader concern we have to support businesses at this time. Obviously, we are concerned that people stay at their jobs as they are able to do that with their employer. And for that reason, we want to make sure that we are supporting companies through this challenging time. The first place we've done that, obviously, has been through providing loan opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses through the Business Credit Availability Program. That's very important. What we're doing today is we're giving temporary wage subsidies to businesses so they can keep people on board. And what we know we need to do in the very immediate time frame is to work with businesses that are in impacted sectors. I've already been working with the businesses in the airline sector. Spoke to 2 of the CEOs last evening. We have a team working with businesses in the oil and gas sector. We recognize that ensuring that we bridge these businesses through this difficult time is critically important. That's what we're working towards. We'll have more work to do with these businesses to listen to their challenges and understand how we can create that support as needed. That's coming shortly as we work with them towards that goal.
Thank you. Just for the interest of fairness, let's keep it to 1 question and 1 follow-up. Yes.
I don't see anything for independent workers who might decide to respect the directive and to stay at home, but who don't necessarily have any children, who are not necessarily ill. Is there something in your plan for that? And if not, what do you plan to do about that? Answer. We want to ensure that people who wish to stay home we want to ensure that they will have the support necessary for that. That means that our emergency support benefit program will be there for them if they wish to, if they must be at home with no source of income. If they're in a situation where they don't have enough money. So there will be this emergency support benefit program that will be there for those people if they must be at home. And the details will be coming up in the next day. Thank you. I've heard that the unemployment rate may reach 20%. Have you done any estimates with regard to what is coming in that regard? Answer. We know that with today's challenges, the challenges in the coming weeks and months, there will be difficulties for many businesses throughout the country, and therefore we need a support that protects people who are in this situation. Today, we cannot put any forecasts in place because the situation is ever changing. That being said, we have an approach, as the governor said, an approach that will be as broad as possible. If there are challenges for people, they will receive the support that they need for them and their families. Thank you.
Minister, I was curious about your Indigenous communities funding. Can you please explain some examples about what that's actually supposed to be used for, what that looks like, and how is it going to be broken down among First Nations, Inuit, and Métis? Is that by number of people in each population, or is that by need?
Well, first of all, let me say that what we're trying to do in this time, we're trying to make sure that the people that are impacted, that are directly impacted by this virus, those who want to stay at home because they need to isolate or we've asked to isolate, or those who lose their jobs have the support that they need. We also recognize that there are groups of Canadians that are particularly vulnerable, and people that are in places that are far away from medical care, people who are in places where food security is a challenge are particularly impacted. We recognize that Indigenous and Northern communities are in that category. We are moving fast in this regard to try and make sure that we have allocated the resources necessary. We recognize that there will be, in cases like supporting Indigenous and Northern communities, there'll be details that we need to continue to work out. We need to recognize that that we don't know all the situations so far, and that we need to prepare ourselves for those eventualities. That's what we're doing in the case of Indigenous peoples, and we're looking forward to working together very rapidly to figure out the details that really constitute your question.
I assume from that answer that you're leaning more towards Indigenous and Northern communities as opposed to urban Indigenous communities. Would that be correct?
I think you should not make any assumptions at this stage. We're going to be very clear and transparent with Canadians about what we know and what we don't know. What we're clear today is that we're providing support for people that we know are impacted. What we're going to continue to do is to support Canadians through a difficult time. And as situations evolve and develop, we will be there for Canadians in all different situations. And that's what we're reflecting today in our approach. And the goal we have is to make sure we have the right resources at the right time for the challenges we're facing. Right now, we're facing a situation where Canadians need to know that they have access to medical care. They need to know they have access to food and the essentials that they require. There'll be a next phase where we might continue to need to support people and make investments to ensure that we can actually come out of this challenge. So there will be more to come.
Thank you. So we'll go over the phone. Juliana?
Certainly. You may now press *1 to ask your question. The first question is from Bill Terry from the Globe and Mail. Your line is open. Please go ahead.
Hi, Minister. You'd mentioned you're working with the oil and gas sector, and there might be something on Orphan Wells coming, but What about governments in oil-producing provinces? You've been in talks for several months about fiscal stabilization measures. We know Newfoundland is in particular fiscal problems. So where are you at in terms of action in response to demands from oil-producing provinces?
Well, thank you for the question. We know that there are going to be things emerge through this challenge that are unpredictable. But some things we can see right off. We know that there will be challenges in Alberta because of the significant impact not only of this virus, but also the impact of the oil prices that we're seeing around the world. That will also have impacts on the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, as mentioned. We're going to work through these challenges individually with provinces as they emerge. Recognizing that what we want is to come out of this challenge. This is a temporary challenge, a difficult issue for us, but a temporary challenge, one that we need to come out of strong, and that's going to be our approach. So we will work with provinces as they come to us with their issues in a way that is protecting the citizens of each part of our country and ensuring that we have the capacity to move forward once we're through this issue.
Do you have a follow-up, sir?
Yes. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business, their reaction is questioning why the support is at 10% when other countries like Denmark are at 75%. And for the governor, if he could weigh in as well, you mentioned the next rate announcement is April 15. What would it take for you to move before that scheduled announcement?
Let me just address the approach we've taken today. We want to make very sure that people have access to financial resources in a time of real need. We know that people are concerned about having access to enough money for essentials, for medicines, for health care, for any form of food or lodging. These are critically important, and so we focused our approach on having enough money delivered at the right time so people can actually deal with the issues that they are facing. We also know that businesses need some support, so we've taken an approach that allows for significant support for businesses right now through a temporary wage subsidy, and also significant support for businesses as they seek to have credit to make it through a difficult time. We don't take anything off the table, so we are going to continue to consider the emerging evidence of these challenges and respond in a way that meets the goals that we're all trying to achieve, to keep ourselves safe and healthy, to enable us to have our families with the things that they need, and to come out of this strong so that we can revive our economy at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Next person.
Thank you. The next question is from Gloria Galloway from Maze News. Your line is open.
Hello, my question is for Governor Polas. What additional measures is the bank considering to bolster the economy, and is quantitative easing among them?
Well, thank you. And let me just answer Bill's question, Bill Curry's question, just before I turn to yours, because they are contextual. So, I was being fairly careful to not rule out actions at any time. There was nothing scripted about the bank's posture. I only mentioned that between now and April 15th, we'll be doing our usual analysis and producing a monetary policy report. The bank staff are hard on that, and one of the big changes that we've got to incorporate in that is this major fiscal announcement that we've just seen. I'm not going to itemize what could cause us to move earlier or not move earlier at this stage. What I think, and blending that with the next question, we've made a lot of moves in just a few days, as I itemized. And just to give you an illustration, I mean, I know it sounds quite theoretical to people. Oh, we have a different repo program or different collateral. Just to illustrate what that might mean, just yesterday, the bank did about just under $35 billion of unusual or say quite exceptional transactions, and that's across a wide range of programs, some of which we had never done before. So I'm very proud of the trading room folks that are getting these things done at a time, especially when we've split our operations into 3 different locations for health safety reasons. And everything's functioning terrifically. I'm knocking on wood there. But for example, we did our first purchase in the secondary market of Canada mortgage bonds yesterday. Spreads on Canada mortgage bonds have come down from, in the almost 70 basis points to around 50 basis points. These are on 10 years. That's a really significant move in the markets, and it's an indicator that action is helping to ease tensions out there. And as I said, this is all aimed at keeping credit channels open so that, we out there, businesses and households have lines of credit with banks. And what we want to make sure is that the system functions well so that banks are still in a position to continue to offer that credit to people when they actually need it, which is in a situation like this. So that back plumbing sort of action that we're taking is very important, and some of these things are just getting underway. So I think it's important for us to take some time here to watch those things unfold and see how the market functions. What other tools do we have? Well, they're the same ones that we've laid out in the past under our extraordinary measures. They are all still in the toolkit. But I think the main thing is that most of these things are scaled, that is, or scalable. So we've sort of started out with a certain number of, as I said, for example, $35 billion yesterday. That's a lot for one day worth of transactions. But we will scale that as needed. Whatever the system needs, this is what we will provide. And we'll continue to evolve perhaps elements of the programs to make them more tailored if need be. But for now, we've got a lot in place, and we want to see how it functions. It seems to be functioning well so far.
Follow up?
I take it that means you're not ruling out quantitative easing.
I would certainly not rule out quantitative easing. Of course not. That is just something that's a standard part of the central bank toolkit. I would say, though, that the things that we are doing right now, that is actively operating in various bond markets, and we're just about to start next week our bankers acceptance program. Well, those things may appear to you as a sort of quantitative easing, but they are not. They are just intended to help markets discover prices more readily when the bond market is dysfunctional. People can't, they get big bid-ask spreads and the market kind of freezes up. So by doing switches and buybacks, the bank can show itself and show guidance into an equilibrium so we get more rapid turnover in the market. So all those things are going hand in hand to make sure I feel like the plumbing is working well. And that means that the rest of the delivery system that's going on can do its job.
The one before going back to the room.
The next question is from Chris Varco from the Calgary Herald. Your line is open.
Hi, Minister Morneau. I just want to know, what kind of assistance are you looking at for the airlines and for the oil and gas sector? Would this be part of the $10 billion liquidity measures that were announced last week, or would they provide a different kind of assistance? Are you looking at things like loan guarantees, direct investments?
Thank you. We recognize that through the course of this virus, we are going to face different challenges from different sectors, different challenges from different sizes of business. We are not ruling out any conclusion in any situation. We're going to actively work with organizations in the oil and gas sector, in the airline sector, in order to come up with approaches that enable them to bridge through a challenging time. That's critical. We're not far enough along in those discussions to identify specific measures that we will take, but we do recognize the urgency of those discussions and are proceeding with that in mind.
And your follow-up? No. Okay, in that case, we'll be going back to the room. Monsieur Blouin, Radio-Canada.
là-dedans de spécifique pour les aînés?
Is there anything specific for the seniors? For example, would there be any changes to OAS rapidly? What about for seniors who are particularly vulnerable? Thank you. We know that there are challenges for all Canadians across the country. Of course, the challenge is more difficult for people who are in a position where they receive less income because of COVID. We want to ensure that our approach is continuing. So seniors can rest assured that they will keep the income that they're receiving, but we have particular challenges, for example, with the change in market prices. There are difficulties for some seniors, and that is why we have introduced an approach that will help people who want to rest assured that they can continue with their to receive their income in future. So we're trying to monitor the situation. If there is something specific that is required, then we will step up. You've talked about an easing of the rules in order to receive EI benefits. And there are also people who have called for an enhancement of these benefits. Why are you choosing not to go in that direction? Answer. The most important thing immediately is that we have to keep in mind people who are not who do not qualify for EI benefits, even if they are having problems. And that is why we are considering how we can ensure that the $5.7 million of our 19 million workers are going to receive something. That is very important. But we have also done things to help a vast majority of Canadians. Our credit approach with the GST is going to help some $15 million, or rather Canadians, and we've also got this enhanced CCC benefit that will help 3.4 million families across Canada. So we have specific measures for a large number of Canadians. And altogether, this is a very comprehensive approach for people who are in situations where they may not be receiving sufficient income. Thank you.
For Canadians to get money in their pockets?
We've worked hard to make sure that the approaches that we're taking will enable us to move forward as rapidly as possible. This has been a key area of focus. Certainly the Prime Minister has been very engaged in this discussion with me. We've looked at both the systems that we currently have in government, like the employment insurance system, and the systems that we have that can enable us to get money out quickly. It's why we've come to the measures that we've come to, because they enable us to get money out rapidly. So we will be working through the Canada Revenue Agency primarily for the GST credit. That will enable us to get that out fairly rapidly, we believe in April. For the approach, the emergency benefits that we've talked about, those benefits will be able to be out within a couple to 3 weeks, very rapidly. We're putting up an automatic system so people can go online to the CRA to actually apply with a very, very modest approach to showing that they have the appropriate situation. And that, we think, will enable people to get money in their family finances very rapidly.
And are you concerned about the optics of closing the U.S.-Canadian border to non-essential travel, that it may lead to consumers, panic shopping or, hoarding groceries more or other supplies? How do you combat that? And as well, can the cross-border supply chain, is it resilient enough to maintain that kind of a shock for an extended period of time?
We've been working very hard with the U.S. administration in recent days to make sure we come up with an approach that ensures that we can continue to have the goods and the things that we need, essential medicines, the food come back and forth across our border, that our broader supply chains can continue, because we want that to be able to maintain our economy now and to allow us to get back to where we want to get back to once we're past this crisis. I think what we've come to is a very good conclusion, that we will enable non-essential workers and travelers. Those people will not be able to cross the border, but essential workers, people that might be working in Windsor from Detroit, or people working in Detroit that are from Windsor, they will be able to go back and forth if they're in the healthcare sector. We'll be able to ensure that goods and services can come back and forth, because our economies will need that economic travel. But other travel won't be moving back and forth. That was an important discussion between the Prime Minister and the President. We're confident that will give Canadians confidence that we'll continue to have what we need. And we will be continuing to work together in a cooperative way as we try our best to deal with everything as it comes up. And that's the approach we've taken and will continue to take.
Hi, Minister Morneau. Molly Thomas from CTV National News. You said your focus is for Canadians to keep food in the fridge and a roof over their heads. So we know that the banks are deferring mortgage payments. I mean, but what about people that don't own a home? What about people that are struggling to pay rent in this time? What are you doing for them?
Well, that's particularly important. We know that there's many different situations for as many different Canadians as exist, and we are trying to ensure that we deal with the most urgent and important right up front, and that's why we've those 5.7 million people who aren't in the employment insurance system. Those people are very important for us to deal with right off. So if they're sick, or if they're quarantined, or if they are laid off or can't work and therefore aren't getting paid, they will have access to funds. The GST low-income credit, which will be providing a significant amount of support for lower-income Canadians, it's a benefit that provides everyone with a family income up to about $56,000 with support. That will help as well. So we are doing our best to make sure that we get the funds to the people who need it most on an urgent basis. And we believe that's the right way to deal with this challenge. And we'll continue to think about other methods to get money to people, but we believe these are the fastest way to get the appropriate amount of funds to the people who are most in need.
Financial bind was 2008, obviously. Are we looking at a worse financial quarter to come than after that? And maybe Governor Polas can also weigh in on that.
I think it's important that we tell Canadians what we know and what we don't know. We can't know the full impact or the duration of the challenge we're facing. We do know that we have one of the strongest, if not the strongest, healthcare system in the world to deal with this crisis. We do know that we actually have perhaps the best banking system in the world to make sure that businesses can still get credit. We have a very strong fiscal position that we're willing to use. So we know that we've got the tools to deal with this. We also know that we have a strong and well-educated workforce to come out of this when the time comes. And we'll support people along the way to get there. As we know more, we will be telling Canadians exactly what we know, and we will be supporting them with measures that are appropriate to the challenges that we come up against. That's what we're trying to do today, and we'll continue with that approach.
So, sorry. You know, I think the minister said, well, we honestly don't know what's coming our way. Fact is, back then, we didn't know what was coming our way either. But I would say that one thing you mentioned, which is worth emphasizing, that is, we actually do have the best banking system in the world, and it is indeed vastly strengthened compared to 12 years ago because of new global standards and I think also lessons that were learned during that period. And those lessons were learned not just by the lenders, but they were learned by the policymakers. So personally, I have great comfort from the seasoned people who I've got around me who were living through that. At the time, I was making loans at EDC. But for example, Carolyn Wilkins was in the trench developing new capital arrangements, new collateral arrangements, new lines to help the situation under Governor Carney. And there she is today doing exactly the same thing behind the scenes. That sort of thing gives me a lot of confidence that, in fact, we are in a better position today in the financial system, and we're ahead in terms of the deployment of those tools compared to back in 2008. Again, I put that up against we don't actually know what's coming our way, of course. But I think we've got the ability to be nimble and adaptable to it. And this fiscal package is going to make a really big difference to the way you envision how that would play out. So I think the other thing we want to prepare for the other side. We know that this is a temporary thing. We don't know how long or how big, but it's temporary. And I know we entered this at a time when the economy was in the best place it had been for a really long time, with unemployment at historic lows and inflation on target and so on. Those are in a strong fiscal position. So all those things make a really big difference to how we will recover afterwards. So I think we can certainly look forward to a robust recovery when the trouble's behind us.
So we'll go back to the phone, but in the interest of time, we'll only take 2 questions on the phone and then 2 questions in the audience. Juliana?
Certainly. The next question is from Kim McCrail from the Wall Street Journal. Your line is open.
Hi, thanks. This question is for Governor Poloz. Governor, I'm wondering if you could describe how Governing Council is communicating at this stage, if things have changed in terms of whether you're meeting in person, your communications have moved to a different format, and how often you're meeting, and when the last meeting was.
Okay, well, we're in pretty constant touch. We met yesterday. We met though mostly virtually. For certain, Senior Deputy Governor Wilkins and I are maintaining our distance. Should either one of us become ill, that we don't affect the other. One of our deputy governors went home and stayed home last week, and a second one who lives in Vancouver is staying home. So we're completely. There's only at most a couple of deputy governors in the building at any one time, and the building's mostly empty except for the operational staff I mentioned before. Anyway, so we're meeting more or less continuously. It was like both on virtual. The Skyping is working extraordinarily well. My compliments to Bell Canada. I was on the phone all day yesterday, and only once did I fail to get a call through. Went to my landline and it worked right away. And so the system must be taking a terrific amount of traffic in this situation. And so all that to say, we're in constant touch, and we're also in very frequent touch with our G7 colleagues. And we're meeting twice a week with the big 6 CEOs of the large banks to get a feel for that. And of course, our market intelligence people are in constant contact with the street, and our operational people are in the market every minute. And so we're getting a constant play-by-play globally and domestically. It's I would say in that sense, operationally, it's working extraordinarily well. So let's just look forward, as I said before, to how all these things we're doing that are different from before, how they play out. Fundamentally, it's about our financial system having access to funding and being able to continue to get things working out through the system. People need it, they get it. Thank you.
Thanks. And can I ask, during your discussions, the discussions Governing Council held yesterday, did you discuss the possibility of a rate cut today?
I don't want to front run our discussions at this stage it's like a continuous dialogue. It's not like we're saying, well, let's talk about this on Friday or on Monday or that sort of thing. We're just talking continuously. We're developing these new tools. We're commenting to one another. What have we forgotten? What haven't we done? So that right now, we'll be in touch all the time, and we'll be able to say conditions have changed enough that we perhaps should have a conversation about this. I won't need to organize a formal meeting. Everybody's available. For one thing, travels. Nobody's traveling anywhere, so it's actually more available than usual. That's it.
Thank you. Next question.
The next question is from Catherine Lévesque de la Presse canadienne. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Oui, bonjour.
Good afternoon. I have a question for Minister Molyneux. If we look at the detail of the emergency care benefit, people have to prove every 2 weeks that they're still eligible. So I was wondering why are you considering easing those options? Because some people may have difficulty contacting CRA. So perhaps some emergency aid should be dispensed. Thank you very much. We wish to have an approach that works very nimbly. We think that we have found the right approach, which means that there will be a very short attestation to ensure that the person in question is indeed in a situation where they require income. And then we will have an automatic, with the CRA, there will be an automatic payment so that they can receive the payment immediately. So this is an approach that we think will work. If there are challenges, because, well, it's the first time we've used such an approach, we will rectify it as soon as possible. And so we will be there for Canadians. We will be there as quickly as possible with the tools required. Thank you. Thank you. My follow-up question is, well, most of the measures announced today are direct support. This will require adoption by Parliament and royal assent. What is going to happen to ensure that this is going to happen as quickly as possible? What is your message? Answer. I'd like to tell the other political parties, I'd like to say that they are working very closely with the government. And we have received a number of recommendations. And in my opinion, we all realize that we need an approach that is going to be in place as quickly as possible. And in my opinion, we will be back to Parliament very, very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are coming back to the room, sir.
Governor, can I ask you, I'm just looking for a figure on purchase of bankers' acceptance notes, municipal and corporate bonds. What's the ceiling?
We have not laid out our parameters around that yet, but it'll be judged according to need. Okay, well, our objective will be market functioning, and so if the market needs only a small amount of activity from us to function well, then it'll be a small amount. But we'll start off with, I think pretty large numbers, and it's more a question of what take up there is. It's like a reverse auction. So you put out, you say, well, we're willing to take up to this much, and see what the response is. So it's more like, what does the market require in order to get through its business week? So that's to begin next week, and I hesitate to use the extreme words around this, but just say, like, all of these things we've done around repos and other forms of lending or involvement in the actual secondary markets, we can scale those up as much as needed. Okay, so there's all kinds of capacity to make them as big as seems to be needed at the time. So we don't have to worry about, like, people are asking, is there more you can do? Well, yeah, you can do everything much bigger one week and not as big the next. It just depends on what the market requires.
And Minister, you've been told by CFIB that businesses will be failing, but the carbon tax goes up at the start of the fiscal year. You've been told by CFIB that people will lose their jobs, but MPs will be getting a cost of living increase on April 1st. Carbon tax, cost of living increase, will you defer those or repeal them on April 1st to set an example?
I think it's important to note that we've been working together with the other parties. I've asked the President of the Canadian Labour Congress and the President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce are both here with us today. We've been working together with Labour and with business to work on an approach that's going to deliver the support that Canadians need right now. And by that, I mean the support that people need to deal with this immediate challenge. So we've had recommendations from both the Canadian Labour Congress and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Canadian Chamber on approaches we can take to deal with both how we support people and how we support businesses through a very challenging time. We've embraced the approaches that they've recommended because we've seen them as being very sensible approaches, things that we can implement rapidly. We've also taken and embraced the approaches proposed by the other parties. I think there's been a good level of collaboration and understanding that we need to deal with the challenges in the immediate term that are right here in front of us, and we need to ensure that we get to the challenges that will be the next set of challenges when those present themselves. That's why I'm pleased with where we've gotten to, but we'll have to acknowledge that we will remain open to considering what the next steps should be based on how the situation evolves. Our approach, as the governor mentioned, is elastic. If we find that we have more people with challenges, we are taking the measures that mean that people can have access to money, irrespective of how long that goes, because we're going to have to reconsider the information as it comes out, and that's going to be quite important for dealing with this challenge. So I want Canadians to know that we will continue to support them, that in a challenging time, the government will be there for them.
Thank you. And for our last question, Madame Lamarche TVA.
D'abord, pour vous, vous dites qu'il reste beaucoup de travail législatif.
You are saying that there is a great deal of legislative work that remains before being able to put all of these measures in place. You're talking about 3 weeks for the emergency care benefit. Are you confident that you can do that in 3 weeks? And for the other measures, how long will they take? Answer. We have already begun our approach with regard to administration, which means that over past weeks we've been working to ensure that we have the facility, the capacity to pay the money out to people, and that is very important. We have to have the legislation, obviously. That must be adopted, and that's why it's important to work with other parties. And in my opinion, we'll be in a very good position to do so in coming days. So we have an approach. We have the possibility of taking robust measures, and we're going to be very transparent with Canadians to ensure every day to monitor where we're at and to ensure that Canadians can have the trust, can trust us to receive the income that they require to meet their needs. Question inaudible for the interpreter. Answer. Well, if we can do it before 3 weeks, we will do so. If we need to take the full 3 weeks, we will. But please rest assured that we're working every single day to find ways of administering what we're doing as possible. How do you evaluate the costs of ensuring the changes at the border? For example, will supply chains continue to work? How much is it going to cost all of these complications at the border, at the U.S. border? Because obviously there will be problems. Answer. our approach concerning the U.S. border is to ensure that we make Canadians' health a priority and to ensure that our healthcare system works. I think that we found the right approach. We're going to continue with essential circulation, but we're going to tell Canadians and Americans that they must stay at home except in cases of non-essential travel. With regard to our economy, our approach is that we want to continue free trade between ourselves and the United States. We cannot be sure right at the moment of what will happen in the future because things are changing every day. But we do have an agreement with the Americans that will ensure that we can continue to engage in free trade, which is very important for our economy. Thank you.
We believe that what we've come up with the Americans is the appropriate approach. We've said that we don't want to have non-essential travel back and forth. So consistent with both countries, we've asked people to stay at home if they can stay at home if they're not essential workers. That said, we'll allow essential workers to go back and forth. We'll allow for commerce to continue because we know that getting medicine, getting food back and forth across the border is critically important for both countries. And so we've taken a practical approach that will protect us and ensure that we continue to be able to have a functioning economy during this challenging time. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you and just to say that what we've tried to do today is to ensure that Canadians have confidence, that we are going to protect them and their families, not only their health, but their ability to afford the things that they need at the time they need it. This is a first phase. It's a very significant phase of helping people directly, of helping businesses to bridge a difficult time. But there will be more work to do as we have more information. I've been particularly pleased with the cooperation of the other parties. It is clear that we all see the importance of working together to support Canadians, and I'm confident that we'll continue to be able to work together in that regard. I've been particularly pleased to see the Canadian Labour Congress and the Canadian Chambers of Commerce to work together to come up with ideas that are supporting Canadians, supporting Canadian businesses so they can support people. This is the sort of thing that we have in Canada that we're so fortunate to have. We will continue to take care of Canadians. We ask that people take care of themselves. And the government will be there to support them as we move forward in these challenging times. So, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for having been here today.
We'll look forward to continuing to keep you up to date as the situation evolves. Thank you, Governor.
All right, you just heard from Finance Minister Bill Morneau and Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz on the situation that COVID-19 is causing. There's no question that this is going to be a significant impact on the economy, and they honestly don't know what's coming their way. They didn't know back in 2008, which is a reference to the financial meltdown back then. But they're hoping that Canadians will have some confidence in the $82 billion financial package that they are providing. This is just the first phase. Obviously, there will be more to come. Let's bring in Mike Armstrong in Ottawa. Mr. Morneau also talked about the banks providing some relief. Tell us about that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of dialogue with the banks, and last night there was a statement put out by Canada's 6 major banks. So you're talking about the Bank of Canada, CIBC, National Bank, Royal Bank, Scotiabank, and TD Bank. So they put out this statement together explaining that there's going to be help for personal and small business banking customers, where people are going to, and businesses are going to be able to defer mortgage payments for up to 6 months. They're trying to find flexible solutions, they say, to help people facing pay disruption, childcare disruption, or illness from COVID-19, things like that. But it's just a measure to hopefully give some Canadians, small business owners also, that oxygen to help them get through this crisis.
Mike, a big part of the $82 billion support package is delaying taxes. It is tax season. Give us some more explanation on that.
Yeah, well, tax season just got a little bit longer. It looks like the deadline is being pushed from April 30th to June 1st. And then the deadline, if you owe taxes, will also be delayed about a month. It's quite interesting. Quebec did this earlier, I believe on the weekend, announced that the tax deadline would be pushed back. But it also came with a bit of a disclaimer. The Premier said that the earlier you get your return in, the quicker you'll get your refund. So there is incentive to get it in on time anyway.
The big announcement today also is that travel will be limited across the border between Canada and the U.S. This is so unprecedented given that they are our longest ally, our best friends, so to speak. What's going to happen there?
Yeah, well, I was going to say as of, but we don't know as of when. That border is going to shut down to all but essential traffic. So tourism is done for now, for example, but there's been an effort to keep commercial trade, food crossing the border, medicine, and people whose jobs it is that are essential, they're going to be allowed to cross the border. The Prime Minister, when he made this announcement, explained that we've been telling people on both sides of the border to stay at home. So closing the border is an extension of that. It would to keep things in order. But the announcement did come originally from President Trump in a tweet about 3 hours ago, and he said details would follow. He's actually meeting the media right now. One thing that is quite interesting, this was done mutually, which is one of the things President Trump mentions in his tweet, that there was this negotiation. Both countries were doing it together. You see the tweet right there. We will be, by mutual consent, temporarily closing our northern border with Canada to non-essential traffic. Trade will not be affected. Details to follow. I haven't heard when that's going to be exactly, as far as when this closure of the border is going to come into effect. But what is worth noting and important to note is that this is not how the U.S. dealt with Europe or China. In those cases, the U.S. did it unilaterally. It is very different and shows that special relationship, I would argue, between the U.S. and Canada, that this was done together.
And you can see that you heard from Bill Morneau, and he reinforced that that was necessary, and this was the best case scenario. Thanks, Mike. We're probably going to get back to you. Let's go to Abigail Beeman. She joins me from Ottawa. Abigail, let's talk about the package. Can you expand on the help for individuals?
There's a few things being offered. I think what we should talk about first is the emergency care benefit, and that is 15 weeks of support. We got some more details from the finance minister than we had initially from the prime minister. It's the equivalent to about $450 a week, which would be paid out on a bi-weekly, $900 bi-weekly basis. This is for anybody who is a caregiver for somebody who is in quarantine, someone who is in quarantine who can't work and does not have access to paid sick leave. Also for parents who are having to take care of children who are out of school. So a lot of people fall into this group. In terms of the nuts and bolts of how you can actually apply for it, the government already has that information up on its website to a degree, but you can't actually apply until April. And of course, all of this still needs to go through the House of Commons first. But this emergency care benefit, beginning of April, the government says you can apply for it. Then there's the emergency support benefit. That's more long-term help for people who lose their jobs due to coronavirus but aren't eligible for EI. I just got an answer back from the finance minister's office because it wasn't very clear in terms of how one could apply for that, since Prime Minister Trudeau said it was already available. I'm being told the details are still being worked out, so you can't, if you've already lost your job, you can't see that help immediately today. They're still working out the details. And another thing I want to touch on, it falls under the help for businesses, which is this 10% payroll subsidy that the government is rolling out, and that could help employees to keep them on the payroll so the businesses don't have to lay them off. You may have heard a question in there to the finance minister that other countries are offering a lot more than 10%, but at this point, Canada is offering 10%. Those are the major highlights as well. Also, I should mention the goods and services tax credit that's being offered. That's additional money for families, a boost to the Canada Child Benefit, as well as a boost to the goods and services tax credit. So that's an additional, they're saying on average about $1,500 extra that should be available in early May. I've also asked, well, how exactly do you get this money? Is this automatic on your tax returns? And now we're saying we're delaying the tax returns. So still trying to get some answers there as to when or how families will see that. Is it maybe based on last year's tax information? Waiting for an answer there, but they're promising this would be about $1,500 in support for low and medium income families who need it accessible around May.
And Abigail, the finance minister didn't really have a timeline for any of this.
Yeah, so it seems like different pieces are eligible at different times, and that's why I immediately fired some questions off to his office, because I know that, I have people messaging me today asking, they're hearing this announcement, how can I access it? How can I get help? It seems that different parts will be available at different times. Of course, again, everything needs to get approval through the House of Commons first to get this legislation through. The EI was supposed to be available right away, or I believe it was a few days ago that the Prime Minister made that announcement, and I'm still looking for some more information there. Although we do know that for those normally eligible for EI who can apply now, that first week waiting period has been waived. But that's now. And then, as I mentioned, in May is when this in April, is when this additional support, this $450 a week, sort of like EI, this care benefit plan, should be made available, but still waiting on some more details for how that rolls out. And then this later boost for low and middle income families we would see that come May. So we're looking at sort of a range from a few weeks to a couple of months here in terms of some of this help that people do need fast.
You bet. And Bill Morneau did say that this is just the first phase, and they're obviously looking ahead. Stay with us, Abigail. We're going to bring in Mike Armstrong, and he's got some new information. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, we've just been watching all the news that's developed since the Prime Minister walked out of that Rideau Cottage, 2 hours ago now almost. News is breaking all the time. I mean, the CBC apparently is closing down a lot of its local newsrooms. That's one thing that's going on. As a matter of fact, the Premier of PEI has already appealed to the Heritage Minister to have the CBC sort of rescind that and keep producing local newscasts. The Hockey News has laid off its staff, and we're just seeing retail already struggling, being hit hard. Restaurants closed, obviously. Tourism. We're not talking about industries that are taking a hit here. They are shuttered at this point. So news has been breaking over the course of the last 2 hours. That Chinese curse is, may you live in interesting times. Feels like that right now, doesn't it, Robin?
Yeah, it does. I think that it is actually teaching businesses a lesson that we might have to be creative. For example, in BC here, restaurants are being told to close, but if they have to stay open, perhaps they could just rely on being a delivery service or a pickup service so that people aren't confined in a space. And now with technology being used more, you and I, look at us, we're Skyping and we're talking right across the country here. I think that's going to be a big play here. And I think really we're all so worried. We journalists are just as worried about the economy and our families. I'm worried about my mother. I'm sure you're worried about your families. This is these are trying times.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, and I was going to point out that my family owns a small inn in downtown Ottawa, just down the road from here. And I'll tell you that it's closed. There's just nobody in there at this point. And it's funny, you get hit by snowstorms sometimes. I was in Miami for Hurricane Irma, and that was a disaster you knew was coming, but it would end at some point. It doesn't feel like we know when the end to this is coming, and I think that makes it even more painful, probably. The government has been quite calming. That's certainly been what they've been trying to express, that the government is there to help you. If you're not getting a salary, we're going to make sure that you can worry about your health and you can worry about your family instead of worrying about putting food on the table.
Abigail, it is so quiet here in Vancouver. What's it like in Ottawa there?
Well, it's very quiet as well. I'm quite high in my apartment here, so I have a pretty good view of the streets and just absolutely dead. You know, I heard you talking about restaurants that are still open for takeout and delivery, and I watched that there are, you know, a couple of restaurants that I can see from my window that have people coming in and out and taking away some takeout. But for the most part, a lot of these businesses are closed, and it's a very eerie feeling to see the streets so quiet. You know, you might think that it's almost like a permanent weekend to have the downtown core of Ottawa so dead, but that seems to be the new reality. And to Mike's point about that anxiety in terms of we don't have an endpoint here, and you know, we as journalists had been covering this, those of us here in Canada, when it began in China, and that was already months ago. And so to process all this data, what we have, and also the data that we don't have in terms of what this will look like on a long-term basis. I think that it will. It's difficult for people to understand. Like, you know, okay, we can self-isolate, we can take these measures, but how long will we be doing this for, and what will life look like going forward? So it stood out to me, not today, but in the Prime Minister's news conference 2 days ago, where he specifically mentioned FaceTime and the importance of reaching out to people and reaching out to loved ones, and how, you know, we are able to connect even if it's not face to face. So certainly a new reality. But when the Prime Minister of Canada suggests that you start FaceTiming your friends and family more, you know, it really stood out to me in terms of how connections are different for the short time anyway, at least.
You heard it from all the ministers, actually, that this reinforcing that this is about your friends, your family, your community. Yes, keep in touch, keep communicating, but keep your distance as well.
If I can point out that it's actually easier to communicate than we might even think. Facebook, I'll point this out, many people might not know. You can do group Facebook chats and have multiple people on the screen at the same time. I would suggest that might be something people would want to do. I would also point out, Robin, while we've been doing this press conference, one thing I'm seeing on Twitter, over the course of the last week, we've been seeing lots and lots of pictures of empty store shelves. We're starting to see store shelves stocked again. Pictures of people saying, look, those supply lines, we kept on hearing that the stores would get supplies. They're getting there. So I saw milk on store shelves and things like that in pictures. It's nice to see, and it does mean that, as the government's been telling us, those store shelves would be restocked. That is happening.
I think that's a relief, because we really have to make sure that we maintain calm here and that we don't panic. We will have, obviously, products on store shelves. Goods and services are still moving across the country. We need to keep reinforcing that. Abigail, let's talk about the Bank of Canada governor. He didn't rule out an interest rate cut when he was asked about that.
That's right. He certainly left the door open. You know, there's another update coming scheduled in April. He certainly left the door open to all options, basically said, you know, everything is on the table. They're taking things day by day, as we've heard, you know, from all facets of government, in some cases really hour by hour. But that we heard from him, as well as the finance minister. And I think that in this evolving situation, it's certainly something that they're still considering.
And Mike, the Prime Minister was questioned about whether we're in a recession or heading towards a recession. He didn't answer it, though.
Yeah, the Finance Minister didn't answer that either. They are saying, one of the questions they were asked was whether we could be looking at a prediction some have made, 20% unemployment. And that was another question the Finance Minister obviously didn't want to answer directly. But it is clear that this is going to be painful, and that, as we talked about before, we don't know exactly when it's going to end. So they were trying to say the help that people need or will need, if we get into a situation that bad, or maybe nearly that bad, the help will be there. That was the important thing that he was trying to say.
Abigail, let's bring you in.
Sorry.
There was some pretty frank conversation that they honestly don't know what's coming their way.
Well, I think that again goes to the point of having officials being open, that they're taking this on an hour-by-hour basis, and we don't have, you know, as full a set of data as we could in terms of testing and numbers, and, you know, in some places where maybe testing is not as easily available, we don't have as much information as we could, and, you know, we're still in the early stages of this. So I think that, you know, the tone the government is trying to take is one of openness, but also one of calm and not trying to cause panic or raise anxiety beyond a level that I suppose is necessary. So yes, we've heard over and over from government officials that they are monitoring this on an hour-by-hour basis. But I think to go back to the point that you were making of pictures of food coming back on grocery store shelves, I think that will help underline people's confidence in the government, be it provincial or federal, because we heard time and time again at news conference after news conference, no matter where you live in this country, we heard officials saying that the supply chains are fine, that the grocery stores are not going to run out of food. There is no need to panic buy, to panic hoard. And I think that is one boost of confidence for people who heard that but maybe did not necessarily believe it, to now see food coming back on the shelves, to see, a shorter wait time. The other day I tried to order groceries online. I think it was Saturday. I was told that they weren't available till pickup for Wednesday. So, when people hear that, it obviously increases concern, but that's more a matter of everybody pulling everything off the shelves as fast as possible than it is the actual supply chain and the actual availability of food. So I think that people seeing food back on the shelves and hearing that matched what the government said to them will make a difference. The next question is, can we get these economic supports in place as fast as the government is promising? And I think that will be the next step to see if that can happen on time.
I sadly don't even have a crumb in my home right now, so I will definitely be doing some grocery shopping, and I'm very grateful to see that the shelves are stocked. Thank you so much for your time, both of you. And once again, the Prime Minister has announced new measures in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Justin Trudeau says in total, the federal government will spend up to $82 billion on measures to support the Canadian economy, $27 billion in direct support for Canadians and businesses, $55 billion to meet liquidity needs for businesses and households through tax deferrals. The total package is 3% of Canada's GDP. The money will come through a combination of direct supports for workers and businesses and tax deferrals. Finance Minister Bill Morneau announced some of the details and assured Canadians that this is a temporary challenge. And of course, you can find full details on globalnews.ca, and we'll have all the latest developments tonight on Global National. Be sure to watch. I'm Robin Gill. Thank you for watching. We return you now to regularly scheduled programming.
This has been a special report from Global News.